Michael Venom Page. MVP fights like someone took a Harlem Globetrotter, fed him nothing but energy drinks and Bruce Lee movies for 6 months straight, then accidentally dropped him into a cage with actual killers who haven't eaten in 3 days. This man stands with his hands dangling at his waist like he's casually waiting for a bus that's running late, bounces around the octagon like he's shadowboxing invisible demons that only he can see, then somehow lands karate sniper shots that make legitimate murderers look like they just started taking weekend kickboxing classes at the YMCA between their shifts at Best Buy. His striking stance defies every principle taught in every legitimate gym on Earth, violates several laws of physics, and probably breaks a few international treaties regarding common sense. While normal fighters keep their hands up to protect their face because getting punched hurts, MVP keeps his hands down by his hips like he's actively trying to get knocked unconscious for the insurance money, or maybe just to see what it feels like to wake up in a different dimension. But then opponents try to capitalize on this obvious opening and somehow end up eating precision counters that nobody saw coming. Because MVP moves like he exists in a different time zone than everyone else, possibly one where time moves backwards and gravity is just a suggestion rather than a fundamental force. His footwork looks like someone trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while simultaneously having an allergic reaction to the concept of standing still. Half his highlight reel looks like someone accidentally hit the wrong button on a video game controller while their cat was walking across the keyboard during an earthquake. He'll throw spinning kicks that look like he's trying to helicopter himself out of the octagon and fly back to whatever planet he came from. Dodge strikes by doing actual matrix leanbacks that shouldn't be humanly possible unless you've had your spine replaced with rubber bands. Then land combinations that appear to violate several laws of physics and probably constitute evidence that we're all living in a poorly programmed simulation. Watching him fight is like seeing someone play MMA on easy mode while everyone else is stuck on legendary difficulty with a broken controller and the screen upside down. The most mind-breaking part is that this approach actually works against elite competition who've spent their entire lives learning how to murder people efficiently. And MVP makes them look like they've never seen combat sports before and learned fighting by watching romantic comedies. Dominick Cruz. Cruz moves like his controller batteries are dying. The connection keeps cutting out, and someone spilled Mountain Dew on the directional pad during a power surge. But somehow this glitchy movement pattern that would get you kicked out of any respectable martial arts class made him one of the most dominant bantamweights in UFC history, proving that sometimes being broken is better than being fixed. Watching him fight is like observing someone who learned footwork from a malfunctioning robot that was programmed by a drunk mathematician who failed geometry, but somehow got hired at NASA anyway. His movement consists entirely of constant resets, stutter steps that make no logical sense, and angles that seem designed to confuse himself as much as his opponents. Like he's trying to solve a math problem that doesn't have an answer while simultaneously having a mild seizure. He'll take 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, shuffle sideways for no apparent reason other than because he felt like it, then suddenly appear in a completely different position, like he teleported there using technology that hasn't been invented yet. Most fighters move in straight lines or predictable patterns that coaches can teach and students can learn. Cruz moves like he's trying to trace the flight pattern of a drunk bee that's also having an existential crisis. The genius of this approach is that it turns every fight into opponents swinging at empty air, while Cruz picks them apart with precise counters that somehow land, despite the fact that he appears to be moving randomly through space like a very violent particle undergoing Brownian motion. He mastered the art of making elite strikers look like they're fighting ghosts who occasionally materialize just long enough to punch them in the face before disappearing back into whatever dimension they came from. His style was so unique that nobody else could successfully copy it without looking like they were having a medical emergency that required immediate intervention from trained professionals. Cruz basically invented a form of movement that exists nowhere else in combat sports, defies all conventional wisdom about how humans should move during fights, and somehow works better than techniques that have been refined over centuries by people who presumably knew what they were doing. Genki Sudo. Genki Sudo treated MMA like it was an interpretive dance performance that happened to include violence, occasional unconsciousness, and the very real possibility of needing reconstructive surgery afterward. This man would literally breakdance in the middle of fights like he was auditioning for So You Think You Can Dance Extreme Violence Edition. Moonwalk away from takedown attempts like Michael Jackson, if Michael Jackson had learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and throw flying submissions like he was starring in Cirque du Soleil, the martial arts musical. His entrances alone were more entertaining than most entire fights, more creative than most Hollywood movies, and probably cost more than some fighters' entire purses. He'd come out in elaborate costumes that would make Lady Gaga jealous, perform choreographed routines with backup dancers who were presumably being paid hazard pay, and generally treat the whole experience like he was putting on a Broadway show that happened to involve people trying to punch him in the face for money. By the time he got to the cage, half the audience forgot they were watching a fight instead of some kind of fever dream performance art piece created by someone who had never heard that sports were supposed to be serious business conducted by serious people who take themselves very seriously. But here's where Genki became truly supernatural in ways that would make Stephen King jealous. All of this theatrical nonsense that looked like it belonged in a mental institution was actually backed up by legitimate fighting skills that could finish world-class opponents who had trained their entire lives to avoid getting finished by people who shouldn't logically be able to finish them. He wasn't just a gimmick who got lucky and happened to stumble into some wins against confused opponents. He was a skilled martial artist who happened to express his abilities through the medium of complete insanity that made normal people question whether they were having a stroke while watching him fight. His career was walking proof that MMA hadn't been completely figured out yet, that there was still room for pure creativity and artistic expression, even at the highest levels of competition, where people are supposed to follow established rules about how fighting works. Ryan Hall turned every grappling exchange into a horror movie for strikers by becoming the human embodiment of every wrestler's worst nightmare about what happens when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gets weird, develops a personality disorder, and decides to start hunting ankles like they owe it money. His entire fighting style was built around one simple concept that was simultaneously brilliant and completely insane, making elite fighters absolutely terrified to touch the ground, go near the ground, acknowledge that the ground exists as a concept, or even think about the ground without having panic attacks about what might happen to their legs if they ended up down there with him. Hall would drop to his back voluntarily like he was taking a nap during a street fight, roll around the cage like a possessed crab that had learned submission grappling from watching too many instructional videos, and somehow turn this approach that looked like someone having a breakdown into legitimate victories against opponents who should have been able to easily avoid or counter such obvious tactics by simply staying standing and not being idiots. But that's the thing about Hall that made him genuinely terrifying. What looked obvious and easily countered was actually the result of years of perfecting positions that existed nowhere else in competitive grappling, had never been taught in any legitimate gym, and probably violated several international treaties regarding cruel and unusual punishment. His leg lock game was so advanced that touching his legs for even a fraction of a second put you in immediate danger of needing reconstructive surgery, physical therapy, and possibly therapy to deal with the psychological trauma of having your joints rearranged by someone who looked like a computer programmer having a manic episode on the ground. He'd invert himself into pretzel-like configurations that seemed anatomically impossible unless you had your skeleton replaced with rubber tubing. Scoot across the octagon in pursuit of limbs like some kind of submission-seeking missile that had achieved consciousness and decided to specialize in orthopedic surgery. And generally make the entire concept of ground fighting look like something out of a fever dream designed by someone who had never heard of conventional grappling, but had watched a lot of really weird anime. Lyoto Machida. Machida fought like he existed in a parallel dimension, where time moved slightly slower than everyone else's reality, physics worked differently, and karate was still considered the deadliest martial art, instead of something middle-aged suburban dads do in strip mall dojos between PTA meetings and midlife crises. This man turned traditional karate from something people associated with children's birthday parties and wooden boards that don't fight back They had never seen combat sports before and learned fighting by watching romantic comedies. His style was built entirely on making opponents miss by the smallest possible margins that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous, then countering with karate techniques that hadn't been seen in high-level MMA before and probably shouldn't work against people who know what they're doing, but somehow worked anyway because Machida operated according to different rules than everyone else. While everyone else was learning boxing and Muay Thai like normal people who wanted to succeed in mixed martial arts, Machida was perfecting the art of fighting like a ghost, who occasionally materialized just long enough to knock people unconscious with perfectly timed counters that came from angles that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. Yair Rodriguez. Yair fights like someone downloaded every Taekwondo moveset from every fighting game ever created, fed them into an AI that had never seen actual human beings fight, then decided to test them all against actual human beings in a professional setting where people are trying to prevent you from doing fancy things by punching you in the face very hard. This man throws tornado kicks like he's trying to generate electricity to power a small village, cartwheel kicks like he's auditioning for a gymnastics team that specializes in violence, and up elbows that look like they were designed by someone who never learned that gravity is supposed to pull things downward rather than sideways through the fourth dimension. His striking arsenal consists entirely of techniques that look like they belong in anime rather than actual combat sports, were designed by people who had never seen real fighting, and probably require a physics degree to understand how they're supposed to work without violating several laws of motion that have governed human movement since we climbed down from trees. Normal fighters throw jabs and crosses because they work and have been working for centuries. Yair throws spinning attacks that require PhD-level understanding of rotational physics to even attempt safely without launching yourself into orbit or accidentally traveling backward through time. The Korean zombie elbow knockout is probably the most video game-like finish in UFC history and definitely belongs in a museum dedicated to things that shouldn't be possible but happened anyway. With literally 1 second left on the clock, when most people would be thinking about going home and having dinner, Yair threw an upward elbow while falling backwards that somehow landed with perfect timing and technique to knock out one of the toughest fighters in the featherweight division. It was the kind of finish that makes you question whether you're watching real sports or some kind of elaborate performance art that happens to involve actual unconsciousness, broken orbital bones, and medical suspensions that last longer than most people's attention spans. What makes Yair truly unique is that his chaotic striking style that looks like someone having a seizure. Diego Sanchez. Diego fought like someone who learned martial arts from watching horror movies, took psychological warfare classes from a failed cult leader, and decided that the most important aspect of fighting was looking absolutely terrifying while walking through ungodly amounts of damage that would hospitalize normal human beings. His nickname was literally Nightmare, which was probably the most accurate nickname in UFC history because watching him compete was like seeing what would happen if pure insanity could be weaponized, pointed at professional fighters, and somehow given a ranking in the official UFC standings. His pre-fight ritual involved screaming like someone possessed by demons who were having a really bad day, slapping himself in the face hard enough to cause concussions before the fight even started, and generally acting like he was preparing for psychological warfare rather than athletic competition between consenting adults who had signed legal documents. By the time the cage door closed, his opponents were already half convinced they were fighting someone who had escaped from a mental institution rather than a trained professional athlete who had passed medical clearance and drug tests like everyone else. The most mind-breaking aspect of Diego's approach was that this apparent madness that looked like it belonged in a psychiatric facility was actually backed up by legitimate toughness and an iron chin that allowed him to walk through damage that would hospitalize normal human beings and send them into witness protection programs. He'd eat combinations that should have ended fights, ended careers, and possibly ended consciousness permanently, then smile like he enjoyed the pain and was having the time of his life, then come forward throwing wild haymakers with the kind of reckless abandon that made opponents question whether he understood that losing fights was supposed to be unpleasant rather than recreational. His fighting style consisted primarily of moving forward, while swinging like a man possessed by the ghost of every bar fight that ever happened, absorbing whatever damage came his way like he was collecting it for some kind of twisted hobby. and somehow convincing judges that pure aggression and psychotic energy were more important than technical striking, defensive responsibility, or basic self-preservation instincts. Sean Strickland. Strickland's uniqueness has nothing to do with his fighting style, which is basically just really good jab-heavy boxing executed by someone who apparently learned social interaction from watching prison documentaries, reading serial killer biographies, and studying old footage of press conferences given by people who probably shouldn't have been allowed near microphones. His technique is conventional, his game plan is straightforward, and his approach to actual fighting is refreshingly traditional compared to most modern MMA fighters who try to reinvent violence like it's some kind of startup company that needs disrupting. What makes him absolutely unique in ways that make publicists have nervous breakdowns is his complete inability to act like a normal human being in any context that doesn't involve punching people, getting punched, or discussing the technical aspects of punching and getting punched. He conducts interviews like he's cutting promos from a psychiatric facility that specializes in treating people who have forgotten how to interact with society. Spars like every training session is a personal vendetta against everyone who has ever wronged him or looked at him funny, and generally interacts with the world like someone who learned about human society by reading about it in textbooks written by aliens who had never actually met any humans. His media appearances are legendary for all the wrong reasons and probably give UFC executives stress-related medical conditions. While most fighters try to build marketable personalities that appeal to broad audiences and don't scare away sponsors, Strickland apparently decided that the best approach was to be as uncomfortable and unfiltered as humanly possible during every public appearance while saying things that make professional publicists consider career changes. He treats press conferences like group therapy sessions where he shares thoughts that most people would keep private even from their closest friends, family members, and licensed mental health professionals who are legally bound to maintain confidentiality. Shinya Aoki. Aoki was the rainbow-tided nightmare who treated professional MMA like it was his personal submission laboratory, and every opponent was a test subject who had volunteered for potentially traumatic educational experiences that might require physical therapy and possibly therapy afterward. This man wore pajama-like fight gear that made him look like he had wandered into the wrong building while looking for a slumber party, then proceeded to break people's arms with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for medical procedures performed by people who have taken an oath to do no harm. His grappling style existed somewhere between high-level Brazilian jiu-jitsu and what appeared to be actual black magic that had been taught to him by demons who specialized in orthopedic surgery and had advanced degrees in making people question whether their joints were supposed to bend in those directions. He'd pull submissions from positions that don't exist in any textbook, had never been taught in any legitimate gym, and probably violated several international treaties regarding cruel and unusual punishment of athletes who just wanted to compete professionally without having their skeletal structure rearranged. The most terrifying aspect of fighting Aoki was that he seemed genuinely unconcerned with the long-term health and well-being of his opponents, their families, or anyone who cared about them. When he locked up submissions, he would apply them with the kind of methodical precision that suggested he was more interested in testing the structural integrity of human joints than winning fights through traditional means like judges' scorecards or mutual respect. His arm-breaking finishes looked less like sporting victories and more like anatomy lessons taught by someone with questionable teaching methods, a complete disregard for workplace safety, and possibly a medical degree from a university that doesn't actually exist. Penn. The Prodigy was unique because he possessed the kind of natural fighting ability that made it look like he had been born specifically to excel at violence, while putting in the minimal possible effort to maintain that excellence. Like he was beta testing what human potential could look like if you removed all the boring parts about discipline and dedication. This man could fight at lightweight looking like a professional athlete, then move up to heavyweight and compete successfully, despite looking like he had spent his training camp eating cheeseburgers, watching television, and maybe occasionally doing some light stretching if he felt like it. His approach to weight cutting was basically non-existent. He'd show up to fights looking like he had gained weight during camp rather than cutting it, then proceed to outclass fighters who had spent months sculpting their bodies into peak physical condition through suffering, sacrifice, and probably some crying. The most mind-breaking aspect of Penn's career was watching him lick blood off his gloves mid-fight, like he was sampling a fine wine that happened to be his own plasma, then immediately transition into pulling submissions on opponents who outweighed him by 40 pounds and had been training since they were children to avoid exactly this scenario. BJ was the first American to win a BJJ World Championship at black belt, won UFC titles at both lightweight and welterweight, and generally proved that pure natural talent could overcome conventional wisdom about preparation and conditioning. He moved up and down weight classes like he was shopping for clothes that fit differently depending on his mood. But here's the thing about Penn that makes his story complicated. His career ended badly, with a 7-fight UFC losing streak that tarnished what should have been a legendary legacy. His later years included outside-the-cage issues that made people question whether his early success was sustainable or just a brief moment when natural talent could overcome everything else. BJ represented the ultimate example of raw talent overcoming conventional wisdom about what it takes to succeed at the highest levels of professional fighting.